Hello, everybody. I think we're going to talk about worldviews very broadly, and I just sort of want to interrogate and understand Vaush's worldview. I'm speaking to Vaush. I think it'll be good. It'll be good. Like Freudian worldview? I think, I don't know. I think it's going to be a very broad conversation. Um, Originally, we were set up to debate on like Big Papa Fascist Andrew's show, The Crucible. But um, Vaush reached out to me on Discord, and I recommended that we maybe just have a conversation and get to know each other's worldviews a little bit better, find points of disagreement versus agreement, and then maybe go and have a debate from there. So this is going to be like our first conversation, and I'm hoping it's pretty civil. We might discuss xenogenders, we'll see. Yeah. Vosh. Oh, it's Flow Trace, my favorite community member. A god amongst men. It's so true. An accurate description. A DGGer, a good DGGer. Amazing. You'd love to see it. Yeah, everyone loves and appreciates Flow Trace because he makes streams interesting. I don't know if Vosh will be able to stop himself from calling you a fascist. We'll see. We shall see. I don't know. I think it'll be good. I don't think we're going to be super combative in our talk. Ooh, Chud Logic is doing his Dr. K stream. What does everyone think of the Dr. K drama? Personally, I think it's a little bit overblown, to be quite frank. I think people are looking for a moral crusade right now. Basically, people are angry at Dr. K because he does like online chats with people and he flexes his credentials as a licensed therapist, but then will like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say like it's definitely not therapy. But that seems reasonable to me to have like conversations. His pseudoscience. I haven't seen like the worst of it, but every time that I've seen a doctor keep bring up like spirituality, he does it like in a very sort of this is the impression I get. I get the impression that Dr. K basically has like life advice for people And he knows that if he frames it in this like spiritual lens, and he's like, these like ancient teachings in India teach this, people are more receptive to it. That's the impression I get every time he brings it up. Which is to say, like, I don't get the impression that he's trying to convert people to Ayurvedic teachings or, spiritually proselytize or any sort of thing like that, or really commit them to believing like every part of this. I think he just brings it up to like demonstrate like this piece of life advice has connections to history that you might be interested in. Yeah. I remember there's drama about this when Reckful tragically passed. But I think it had kind of settled until Mr. Girl came along and decided to reignite it. Mr. Girl's still a literal who. Is it the equivalent of Jay Peterson but with Hinduism? Hmm. If you dislike Jordan Peterson, that's going to be a very unflattering comparison. But I would say there are comparisons that are reasonable. Yeah, discussion with Vaush about Vaush. And about me, I guess. I think the Mr. Girl's really interesting. I think he has a really interesting way of communicating. Yeah, I agree. I don't think that it doesn't seem to me that Dr. K is like in it for fame or money necessarily. Because, like someone in chat brings up, if he wanted to make lots of money, his Harvard credentials could earn him lots of money and a lot like more safely. I think he's really interested in the kind of the topics he brings up genuinely. I think he probably genuinely wants to do good. And the question of like, is he actually doing harm to people? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would say he's doing harm to people. I don't think that has been demonstrated very well. Oh, he hasn't gone to Harvard? I must be misinformed then. Taught at Harvard. Okay. So, yes, Harvard credentials then. Just not educate. He was not educated there. His claim to Harvard cred is a bit weak. Okay. I don't know all of his history. I just know that is a criticism of him, that he flexes Harvard credentials to give online therapy. Yeah, I would agree. I would say that teaching at Harvard is much more prestigious than, um, just having an undergrad. Vaush and I are going to discuss worldviews. I'll update my restream. Which is very broad. Very broad, to be fair. I don't have a really nice view. I just see like the neighborhood outside. I think there is like a big thread on his Discord where people are saying that he should talk to me. 4404. I don't know what that means. But for a good reason. Destiny's pretty nuts and jumps at everything he says. I think Destiny's also a really interesting thinker, and I've enjoyed talking to him. But Destiny's latest arc on Twitter has been really not good. It's been crazy. And it's like frustrating because I think Steven does this thing where he will be extraordinarily inflammatory on Twitter. And then if he's confronted about it, he'll say things like, well, I just don't want people to like put themselves in positions where they might be liable to be sexually assaulted. And I want people to like know their own capabilities to prevent that kind of sexual assault. Which, when you back way up, that's like a reasonable position to have. But the way he chooses to express this is by like calling sexual assault survivors like retards and like idiot children, which I think is an incredibly immature way to deal with the topic that is only productive in like benefiting your bottom line and like getting clicks and views. That's the only like ability to only benefit. Like you're not meaningfully like progressing the dialogue. You're not meaningfully like opening up conversations with yourself and others. You're just like making people hate you. He absolutely does enjoy it. Yeah, it's very true. So you can't like criticize him. Like it's very hard to criticize him. It's very hard to like convince him not to engage in this sort of behavior because one, he enjoys it, and no doubt two, it also gets people talking about him, which means more people like subscribing to his stuff. So what's the pitch to him? Like, well, if you want to like advance your if you want to advance a perception of yourself that is like a positive contributor to online spaces, then you should engage it in this way. And he's just going to say, well, I don't have that reputation and never will. So yeah, I think it's a little bit difficult to criticize him. I like book smarts a lot. You don't even think he wants to have that reputation. I think some of the things that he does like indicates that he would want that, especially when he was trying to do like more real world political stuff. I think he very quickly ran into like some of the troubles with having a nasty online reputation. But yeah, I don't know. Now he's committed to league streams, hanging out with the boys in Miami. Yeah, only we hung out with the boys in Miami. I might hang out with some other internet people where I'm at. We'll see. I've talked with some people about doing something IRL. I don't know if it'll come to fruition, but I think it'd be cool if it did. I would say that I have very politically unpopular views. So it wouldn't surprise me if people were like a little bit hesitant to associate with me. Dan on stream is becoming an endangered species. I love Dan so much. Mhm. Dan and Cheddar, the new best friends. Is that true? Honestly, I know very little about Vaush in general. Um, I know that he's sort of like this gatekeeper for the online left and political conversations. I know that he's very big. I know that he started off as like sort of a Destiny clone. I watched a video of Vaush's very early on. I don't know if it was in like 2019 or 2018. It was very early on in his career. He had like 4,000 Twitter followers. And so I guess he had rebranded as Vaush at that point. Um, and I told him that it was like a good video on Twitter. So there's like really old records of us interacting, just like very briefly. Yeah, I'm a Christian Puritanist. I'm a trad Cath. Chat motherfuckers are always wilding. It's insane. Yeah, good old Irish laddie back in the day. Back in ye olden times. Yeah, I get the sense that Destiny is someone who's very difficult to be friends with. That's true. Vash's big thing is like workplace democracy, which I'm like quite skeptical of. But he's also had conversations with like a few people already, um, Rose Wrist and Kano Boy on this like very topic. And from what I've seen is that like he concedes quite a lot of points. He'll say that like, yeah, I'm not convinced that they'd be like economically beneficial or it actually leads to like a market improvement in people's lives. I have an ideological reason for supporting them. And that's that I believe democracy is like a good unto itself. And then I think his idea is that like with time, democratizing the workplace will prove to be beneficial in the same way that like democratizing the state proved to be beneficial with the United States, which I think is also, I don't know, I think there's some like maybe some recency bias here. The United States has not existed for very long. Most successful states in human history have been autocracies ruled either by aristocrats or kings. I'm 99% sure he's a utilitarian, but he has a strange obsession with democracy. Right. I know that like the big meme is that Vaush is like a big utilitarian guy. But clearly here's like an exception. I don't know if I really want to like push him on the democracy point though. Just because he's had this conversation so frequently in the last week or so. I definitely don't think it's like his strongest point though, which I think is maybe why it's a little bit strange that it's so central to his belief system. Well, I think most people in the average workplace are just not interested in like voting in policy. Like most people just don't care. They just want to go to work. They want to get through it. They want to get their pay and they want to leave, right? That's how most people approach work. And there are people who are very active in work and who work very hard, and those people get promoted and those people go to leadership positions, or they become people who those in leadership positions go to for influence and advice. So I sort of think that like workplace democracy is one of these things where if you implemented it, all the same people more or less would basically still be making the decisions, which is like the most motivated and capable people in the organization. Forced co-ops would become like forced homeowners associations, which suck. Yeah, I think that's a good point for sure. Because what happens in homeowners associations is you have like a small number of people who just like dominate and like basically legislate like all the rules and force everyone to like pay attention to rules. And most people don't fucking care. They don't want to go to the meetings. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to take out time in their day to do like politicking with these bored housewives over what rules should be allowed for the neighborhood. And that's exactly what's going to happen with probably forced co-ops. And I mean, that's what happens with real world democracy with the United States. Most people don't fucking care about real world democracy, right? We can barely get a majority of people to vote in national elections, much less local elections. Do you have an opinion on Adam something? I've seen some of his videos. They seem pretty good. He's like very into like trains and like he's part of this like new urbanist project, which I think is like cool. I don't have any problems with. I like actual Justice Warrior. I feel like he'd be fun to talk to, but actual Justice Warrior gets like a lot of stuff wrong at the same time. Oh, Destiny versus Gavin McInnes. I'll definitely watch the VOD. That's a very interesting conversation. Yeah, I think if the point is to take power, is to shift power away from like owners, managers, and shareholders and to like your average worker, I think that that can be done with much different policies that are much better, much more beneficial, much more useful than like forced worker cooperatives. And this is like the point that Boy makes. I think that like unions are really effective. Unions are really cool. And so I would personally push for like more union membership. Destiny debate starts at 9. 9 what time zone? Yeah, it's with Vaush. 9 East. Okay. I haven't worked with the workers' union. I'd be interested to. I mean, I've talked with Kyo a little bit, and he's like another big on unions type guy. I don't think it'll be a big debate, because I don't want to make it like very mean. But I think we're going to just talk with Vaush, and then we're going to set up a debate for another time. I think is the goal. Seems to me like AJW falls victim to the problem of political culture war. YouTubers needing to put videos out on whatever issue. Yeah, that's true. Um, I saw a video by Actual Justice Warrior where he talked about like San Francisco shoplifting, and he made it out to be like there was this like horrible, like epidemic crime spree that was like tearing apart the city. The city had become like a dystopian place to live because of like terrible shoplifting. And I looked into the data, like of shoplifting since their new laws had come into effect, and shoplifting was like not particularly changed. I think it was even like down some years. So I felt like a little bit frustrated with him because of that. I think I even like told him on Twitter, I was like, are you going to address how this is like not at all based in reality? Mm, I don't know his GME video. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of I don't know. The longer you follow online politics, I think the easier it is to become like, disillusioned with the tendency of people to just like cheerlead their own team and ignore whatever the real world data is. Screen is shaking up and down. It's because I'm shaking my leg, probably. I am not going to stop lewd posting now because I'm not making any money from streaming. So I like coffee. I'm not like a strong, I don't know, I don't fall on either side very strongly, but I like coffee. I'm going to stop the Twitch stream. I want to tell everyone to go to my YouTube stream. I have no idea what jobs Vosh has had to work before. To be fair, I have not had a lot of working experience either. I've never had like a full time proper job, just like part time jobs. Wow, mods in chat. I love to see it. Wage slavery is making me very depressed. You know, I think that there's like a real crisis of meaning in our culture. And I'm just going to hammer on this repeatedly because work in of itself, hard work, is something that like ideally you should want to engage in. You should have a reason for engaging in it. And your ancestors who were like working to survive, to not starve to death, that's like a pretty good reason. But in the modern age, so much of those like base wants are sated. It's, if you have a roof over your head and you can put food on the table consistently, um, I think people struggle for like a reason, for meaning in life, for a reason to keep working to work hard. And I think that's where like working for the benefit of your family or your community or your church or your union, I think that's really important. And so, like, it strikes me as like quite a shame that people have like such disgust and frustration with work. Because ideally, like the actual difficulty of the work should not be like the main factor in whether or not it's good or bad. There's really hard work that you can do that can still be fulfilling and meaningful to you, but there has to be a reason why you're doing it. And I think the traditional reason, like proposed by people, yeah, exactly. You don't have a family or a church, and your union does nothing. Exactly, exactly. This is the problem that a lot of modern people find themselves in, where they're individualized, they're atomized, they lack community, and so they have very little reason to work hard or to believe in working hard. And the reason given to them by society is like, well, you get to consume these things. You get to consume fancy new items, shiny new toys, the latest, Marvel movie. And I think that's just not cutting it for people. And so people are looking for avenues to justify and contextualize their alienation. And I think Marxism, socialism, these are ways that people use to contextualize and understand their isolation and their frustration with work. But I don't think they actually get to the root heart of the problem. Um, shifting more power to workers, I think is good, but I don't think it's really tackling the crisis of meaning. No, idealistically, you should want to work hard because you should have things in your life that are worth working hard for. And like the gentle labor, like humans are the only organism whose work involves things that have nothing to do with but survival needs, but is needed in order to pay for survival. You're just describing like specialization of labor, which has been massively beneficial, right? Like a shoemaker in medieval Europe, who was part of the shoemakers guild and outfits everyone's shoes in the town, he's not working to like feed himself. He's not a subsistence farmer. Being a subsistence farmer sucks. Like it's backbreaking, brutal survival work. And I wouldn't say that like the shoemaker is so much worse off because he's not actively working to survive. Um, in fact, he actually sees like the product of his labor in his community. There's a lot of benefit in that, and in feeling connected to those around him. And it's good that he does this because he can get really good at making shoes, and other people can get really good at cobbling the streets, and other people can get very good at farming and so on. And they can trade with each other, and they can create a society that is better for everyone. Yeah, I think history is written by the victors, and the victors were the Renaissance thinkers. And so they've painted a very dreary picture of medieval life. in feudal life. Here's an idea that everyone's gonna love. Bring back feudalism, but have people like Elon Musk as the feudal lords, and just have technocratic God King CEOs. Doesn't that sound amazing to you? Isn't that based? I can see everyone in chat. They're excited. They're hyped up by this idea. Listen, I want to go to war for Elon Musk's army against Jeff Bezos' army. I want to raid his villages and lay siege to his castles. That's what I want. Right? Finally, someone is brave enough to give the take that we've all been thinking. Guys, you need to read. I'm gonna talk with Vaush at like 8 p.m. Probably. That's when he said. Vaush isn't late. We still got like 15 minutes. And even then, we might be waiting a little bit. Because he was like around 5 p.m. Pacific time. And I was like, okay. Yeah, I'm sure Vaush will have incredible salient positions. Cats are superior pets in the modern age. Taftaj v Vaush. So true. So true. I would not agree that Portland's on fire. Yeah, time to go sicko mode on Vaush. Destroy him. Just break him in the battle marketplace of ideas. Definitely going to win. I'll try my best to remember all the training. But yeah, we're gonna talk with him. I mean, I think he talks sort of like me, which he tends to see as like pretentious language, right? This is like a bad habit of mine, where I will use like just like stupid fucking incomprehensible words And people will be like, what the fuck are you talking about? And then I have to back up and explain. And I hate that. There's actually a study on like the use of complex or unusual words, and it indicates that like it decreases perceived intelligence for the person using them. Indicates autism. Yeah. I don't know. I sort of think pretentious words are incomprehensible. At least that's what I mean. There's a discussion that I got into where I brought up the concept of epistemological equity and was talking about like truth claims and epistemology, epistemics, and so on. And I went on this whole tangent for like a minute and a half, maybe. Seemed like longer. And Doobie just like stopped me and he was like, you need to rephrase in words that are like understandable by every people. And so I did, and I apologized. I was like, yeah, I'm definitely gonna be polite if it comes to blows.
Can you believe it? The Horde and Alliance are fighting each other again.
The singularity. I'm not sure if this is the singularity you're talking about, but like I read like Nick Bostrom's book on superintelligence and the superintelligence like singularity, which I think is like I think he makes very convincing arguments as to why that might be a scary scenario. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. None of these are really good. Fuck. Interesting. I'm not sure if I agree with that take. The singularity is like ultimate entropy. What is this about horses? Elaborate. I don't know what you're talking about. A horse enjoyer.
I'll clean you up.
Hmm.
Don't tell the others. I'm rooting for you. Rough battle.
Yeah,
Pick yourself back up
like
and turn it around.
MG gamers. I'm glad this is your impression of me because this is definitely like how I try to present myself as someone who's identifies with right-wing ideas and conservative ideas about family and community and God and so on. And yet like does away with some of these like more pernicious ideas like racism, homophobia, and whatnot. I don't think you need to have, for example, like homophobia to have a church. And I think that the left has like very successfully weaponized like this social issue to degrade the credibility of like church institutions. And it's been a political ploy, but very much to the detriment of people in general.
Welcome back. How's it going out there? Hey, watch out. I'm thinking.
I'll clean you up.
Yeah, no, I'm not interested in being like a conservative, like National Review type, like Charlie Kirk, let people walk all over you. What I'm interested in is like really isolating the most important parts of right wing thought, the core essential beliefs about order, hierarchy, community, and whatnot, and pitching those to people. I would say that I believe in God, but like this is definitely a discussion for another time because like the way that I conceptualize God is very different than the way that other people do. Yeah, the anarchists are stupid. It's okay if they're triggered. Yeah, I mean that's another good point that like homosexuality, even among the Bible in the Bible, is like one sin among many. And it's not like a grave sin. Um, Especially like transsexualism too. Like wearing a woman's clothes as a man is a sin. Sort of, but it's also like put in a place in the Bible with like a lot of other sins that people don't really care about. Yeah, only a couple of lines that mention cross dressing.
Come back.
Yeah, I don't think that trans people are sinful by their very existence. Though, technically speaking, like you could live in accordance with the Bible and transition hormonally. And there's arguments against this, but biblical arguments against this. But it's not like explicitly wrong to do.
Really raging out there.
Did you just see that? How I got so blessed? Oh, and I miscalculated the gold. That's okay. Whoops. Yeah, double salty looter. Feels good.
Don't tell the others. I'm rooting for you.
And again, I would say that I'm religious, but it might just have to be like a conversation for another time. Because the ways in which I'm religious are like weird. And my definitions for God are unusual. But basically, I think it's important to have a sense of morality that exists outside of yourself, a sense of what is good and what is evil, that is not wholly dependent on like your own rationality. Okay, I'm gonna talk with Vaush, so I will end the Twitch stream. And I'm going to link my YouTube stream. So if you guys want to continue talking to me, oh, you want to continue talking? Oh, stream court did an announcement. Okay. Okay. Go to YouTube. Twitch is ending. Goodbye. Oh my god. Okay, everyone's in YouTube. Feels good.
Howdy.
Vaush. Hello, Mr. Vaush. Should I call you Vaush or is there another name that I should use?
Everyone calls me Vaush, so that works for me.
Okay, right on. I'm gonna turn up your volume just a bit.
Vaush, sometimes. There's actually a lot of
Vaush.
variety.
I think if I want to annoy you, I should call you Vaush, right?
No, I like it. I like it always. I've grown increasingly flexible with every interpretation of the name.
Good for you. Not letting those people mispronouncing your name get you down. See, Destiny
Exactly.
does that with my name, which, to be fair, it's a difficult name to pronounce. But he makes fun of me for it constantly.
Well, I said Taftaj. Did I get that wrong?
You must have the biggest brain in the world because I think you're one of the only people to get this correct.
Wait, what? Wait, what's the other default thing a person would go to?
I think people just like misread the letters or like read them out of order. Like I
Yeah,
hear like
okay.
Tafja a lot, where they just like mix up the J and the E. Listen,
Um,
we're not working with the brightest tools in the shed here.
I know a lot of dyslexics out there.
Yeah,
Only so much you can do.
we accept it. Okay, we're not ableist here. We accept it all.
There we go.
Okay, sweet. I will add you to my stream.
Oh, you're not streaming on Twitch, are you?
I am not.
Wise.
I was very
Uh,
careful not to do that.
Yeah, apparently there's some flexibility with those rules, but you never want to be the exception. I did not expect to get banned, for example, for saying cracker, but I'm happy I'm sticking with my convictions there, I guess.
I had to make an exception out of someone, right? The discourse was
Yeah,
in full swing. Someone had to take the brunt.
it's rough. But it got a few articles written about me, so that was fun.
That's pretty sweet. That's good. Good
So,
engagement for you.
oh yeah. So, for context for anyone who's watching, I guess from my side of things, I imagine your side already has context, but um, normally I'm aware of larger figures in the online political space because well, you have to be, of course. It's kind of it's your job to. But I was informed by Big Papa Fascist that you
Mhm.
were interested in talking. And I saw you on Twitter, and you had like a 6-digit number of Twitter followers. And instantly I thought, oh my God, I've been sleeping. What's going on? But apparently you've recently forayed into political discussions.
Yeah, I've followed like online Twitch politics for a long time. Just as like it was my favorite soap opera and I liked the drama. I liked that I was able to like stay vaguely informed and I was hip to know if there was like something that I needed to look into if it was coming up in political discussions. So I enjoyed that aspect and I reached out to Destiny to talk to him. I wanted to debate him on trans DIY healthcare. I thought his takes were like not good. So reached out to him, talked about it. Destiny does this thing. I'm gonna throw a little bit of shade at Destiny, even though I very much enjoy talking to him, where he will sometimes put out extremely spicy takes on the internet, and then if you confront him about it on call, he's much more reasonable. And so we had a conversation, and he agreed that like trans DIY can be justified. He just dislikes like some of the online culture regarding it.
Those damn Twitter lefties getting in the way of a good and consistent take yet again.
So true.
Um, I no, I no, I saw some of that discourse kind of in the periphery. I don't know that much about DIY hormone stuff, but I feel like in any other situation where there's a strong medical need for some kind of pharmaceutical assistance, which can be DIY'd, but maybe necessarily it's better to get it from like a doctor if the doctors aren't providing it to you. I mean, imagine if it was like insulin or something, right? Like, there'd
Mhm.
be communities around this. And trans healthcare stuff is very positively associated with good health. So it's probably important to take that seriously.
Yeah, and the argument that I made was just that like if you're the kind of person who believes that like general recreational drug use can be justified and people can be like informed enough to make decisions about what they put in their body in general, then this is like on that spectrum, it's on the justifiable side for sure.
Yeah, I mean, most bodybuilders do DIY testosterone injections, and they're not even trans, right?
Mhm.
It's gotten safer with time too. I remember back in like the I think the 90s, DIY testosterone injections led to a lot of people getting injured because the science wasn't as well understood back then. But now Joe Rogan can go into his platform, admit that he takes testosterone, for funsies, so he can stay beefy. But we still get to have this conversation about whether like trans women can have. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah, and estrogen is, I think, not so dangerous compared to testosterone. So yeah, I don't know. It's quite the discourse. Which I don't know. What's the current discourse as of now? Is it Hassan's
Has-
car? Is that the big thing?
Hassan's car, it updates on an hour by hour basis. It's probably Hassan's car.
Okay, reasonable. What is your take on this?
I really don't care about rich people buying rich people things when they're socialists. I mean, obviously, there are varying exemptions to that. If buying a plane ticket to Epstein's Island, is a rich person thing, but it's not bad because of the rich person thing. It's bad because of the Epstein Island thing. The thing that actually bugs me about the Hassan business right now is the conspicuous consumption element,
Mm.
because the video his producer put out looked like it could have been like a Logan Paul tier, like look at me flex my wealth, watch my YouTube videos because hustle, grind, set, etc., etc. And there's the cultural issue for me, I guess, is that like I don't have an issue with socialists being wealthy, but I think it can be a little bit. I think there are negative externalities associated with flaunting that wealth in ways which reinforce the association a lot of people have between wealth and well-being. Which is why I don't mind them being rich, but I do mind them flexing. I didn't like it when Nico Lowell did her giant like apartment apartment tour. It was like a $2 million apartment or whatever. You can do this with varying degrees of irony, but like let's be real. A ton of people watching Hassan are just going to see like the Porsche video and go like, "Oh, dude!" Like it's going to be pretty similar to like if they were a Logan Paul fan. Just, "Oh, dude!" Whoa, like YouTubers flaunting their wealth is a time honored thing. Whatever level of irony you're engaging in, it's still something I'm a bit uncomfortable with.
I mean, I think I've also heard the argument from you that Vaush does a lot, or not Vaush, Hassan does a lot to advance like the conversation on Twitch and elsewhere and make socialism seem like the kind of thing that is palatable to people. And so like his broad outreach, the good of doing that, to introducing people to like leftist ideas, even if they're on like a very basic level, outweighs like the kind of harm that he's doing maybe by like purchasing these items, or just like is so great that we don't necessarily need to demand that he also spends all of that money in his own local community. Is that like an adequate summation of your position?
Yeah, it's just largely unproductive because when you normalize that line of thinking, it's so often not about maximizing positive outcomes and instead becomes about a kind of purity test, which I really don't
Mm,
like in general. Conservatives are really fond of this. They were talking about how Bernie Sanders has three houses or whatever. Like one of them's this little shack and one of them he inherited and he's like 90 years old and he wrote a book or whatever. But if you normalize that line of accusation, there's not a point where people are going to stop and go like, oh well, that's acceptable. They'll get away with what they can, and oftentimes like the people who are making those accusations don't like the people they're making them against already.
mhm.
So if it wasn't a super expensive car or a super expensive house, you could run that threshold down really, really far, right? People don't accuse me, for example, of like overly flaunting wealth because, well, first of all, I make probably a tenth of what Hassan does. And second, I just sit here in my room, I guess. But, if people wanted to, they could talk about how the guns that I've bought over the past couple of months total about $8,000. So, like, that's not something an average person could afford. You're flaunting a kind of wealth in that respect. And then it's like, well, shouldn't that money have gone to this, that, or I don't really think it's about making the world a better place. I just think it's about like what can we use to enable the purity test. So it's just not that functional of a line of argumentation for me.
Do you think someone could deliver the argumentation in good faith and genuinely like mean what they say about making the world a better place?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, they
Okay.
can deliver it in good faith. It's just it's one of those things where there are cases where I think a good argument can be made, and certainly an argument in good faith, even if I disagree with it. But as an aggregate, that type of argument just tends to be a waste of time, which is something you can empirically prove because every time it comes up, it's a massive waste of time. Nothing actually happens. Nobody changes their behavior. Hassan won't change his behavior because most of the people making these arguments clearly just hate him and are doing the socialist but money argument. There's no like nuance or refinement, so he won't change his behavior. Nothing actually. Yeah, I don't know. Especially like if we're talking about broader social problems, like socialists controlling a lot of society's money and spending it on themselves isn't a thing. Right? Like that if you were looking at demographic statistics, like that's not a thing that exists. It's like here are some guys who we think are too wealthy to be socialists. We're not talking about social problems, just personal accusations. And yeah, again, just it's just discourse.
I mean, I think for me, it speaks to maybe like a criticism that I'd have of more lefterly people. And I guess this is also to some extent a criticism of like conservatives and their inability to address this. But I think I see with the left, there's a lot of push to like have the government manage things and have these like national level solutions. And there's not a lot of focus, or I think enough focus, on the community level and the people closest to you, which I think that the average person can have a much better, more positive impact. And to some extent, like I don't blame lefterly people for this because like, take something like the minimum wage, right? If the minimum wage were abolished tomorrow, we wouldn't be like Denmark, right? A lot of people would suffer because they don't have those institutions, those unions in place to take up that slack and to bargain for them. So there's like a lot of reliance on the government and the national government to set these kind of bargaining stances for the average worker. But I think that like it's a little bit sad to me because I think we've seen like in the modern era more and more erosion of these sources of community, of which unions is one of them. And we see that they have like such beneficial effects in other countries, but sometimes the left wing like insistence that everything be solved on the national level is like maybe not the best.
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all. Um, especially since we have a fairly partitioned government here in the States. Usually you can run more interesting experiments on a local level. There have been times where socialists have controlled towns, or they've even had a significant way on state governments. Nationally, you run into some problems. There's an exponential increase in the amount of opposition you face. So I agree that people should focus more on local level tier stuff. I understand it's difficult to do that from some elements, though. Obviously, like if you're a live streamer or a YouTuber who talks about politics, discussing individual, like local level stuff is difficult because you're not local. You have people watching you from around the world. So, in terms of like maximizing the attention that you can bring to local issues, I think it's more of a process based thing. Maybe I can't talk about everyone's hometown, but I can talk about hometowns. You can't talk about every city council meeting, but you can talk about city council meetings. And I think we could see a lot of benefit if we did that. Turning Point USA, for example, has been really aggressive in getting these psycho schizoid fucking parents to charge down local PTA meetings to scream about how they're doing Jewish blood libel Marxism by making their children learn about homosexuality or something. This is an effective political strategy. It's not great politically, but it's effective for what they
Hmm.
want. And maybe we can get our own delusional schizoid parents to run down there and talk about how it's literally fascism to explain to children that the Native Americans in Columbus got along for a bit. Um, Hopefully, we can get them a bit more directed than that. But yeah, I agree, local action's important.
Yeah, totally. And so sometimes when I see like someone like Hassan, who is like significantly advancing these like broader conversations, I think from like a left wing or progressive perspective, that is like helping the cause. But sometimes I wonder if like the willingness of the left wing online to let Hassan, do that and be justified in doing that while not really holding him to any sort of obligation for those around him is maybe a symptom of like this larger problem, which is like a shift away from local institutions. So I don't know. I think it'd be like there's a lot of people in America who are a fan of a public option for healthcare. There's a lot of money behind, that. A lot of people willing to engage in a program like this. And I think that maybe if people were willing to like really work to implement that in their own states, which are as large as some European economies, you could see like really good, progress. Or at the very least, like a demonstration of these ideas if they work. And moreover, they'd be like tailored to the individual populations that they're, giving healthcare to for, giving healthcare to. And so, that is like a big frustration with me. But I think it's also like a point of potential agreement um, between left and right people. Like you talk about like alienation from work, and Marx describes like if someone's building a chair and like they don't see the fruits of that labor, they don't see the chair being produced or used in the community, that's like very alienating. They're made to feel like a cog in a machine with which they have like no insight or interaction with. And so I think that like maybe connecting people to their communities is like a very important political project. And one of the ways you can do that with unions, but like another way would be like through a church, through a local religious organization or a neighborhood.
Oh, sure. Edgy Reddit atheism aside, yeah, no, I do think in a lot of communities, churches actually are one of the only local loci of meaningful community discourse, which is a damn shame. But yeah, no, it's important to work towards that. There are multiple layers of alienation. I think that,
Mhm.
for example, the fact that our workplaces are autocratic contributes to it significantly. We don't have any meaningful say in the nature of our workplaces. We just, we're in there, we follow the rules, we leave, or we get kicked out. I think there are plenty of things we could do to address that. Sometimes it's like a lefty advocacy thing, but oftentimes, as used to be the case with unions, I think it's just about shifting the priorities of the American people, or maybe having them be more cognizant of priorities they already have but don't understand fully. An example of that would be like European cities. Americans love European cities, they adore them, they spend lots of money over there, and then they go back home to American shit tier cities, and they're like, well, that was fun. They already like the things that are over there. They like public transportation. They like walkability. They like, well kept old town areas where there's mixed, residential and commercial zoning. So people can live in an apartment above a coffee shop, walk right outside, and be like 2 minutes away from a market and a grocery store. Like humans like living like that, you know? But then we come back to America and it's like, well, sorry, it's suburbs. It is 20-minute drive to the local strip mall. Well, that's just how it has to be. So, in lieu of that, the solutions Americans come up with to their problems are always going to be limited by what we think is possible, and a lot of people don't think very much is possible. So, whether it's done from a left, like explicit perspective, or just as a sort of general humanist project that doesn't have an explicit political heading, I think you could make a lot of headway on alienation by, you know, getting people used to the idea that, local small businesses and craft stores, even if they're less economically efficient, can still improve a community. That there are benefits to having more control over your workplace. It would make people happier at the very least. There's good data on that. It's not just conjecture.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring up like the zoning laws and the ways that we've constructed our cities. And you say that like Americans can feel in European cities that something is like better, something's more enjoyable. And, we can see like the benefits of public transport. They transport so many more people for a fraction of the cost and so on. And yet, if you go to like an American city, oftentimes, none of that kind of infrastructure exists. And these are like cities where people can democratically like go to their local politicians and they can petition them, or they can run candidates, or they can vote against people. But we see is that, it's so hard to get Americans to vote or engage with local politics at all, whether that be, statewide or, citywide. We can barely get like a majority of Americans to vote for a national election, which they've been like constantly inundated with news about how important and dramatic it is, and like all these big, big ticket candidates and political parties, action committees, and so on that are trying to encourage people to vote for their candidate. And we're still, a massive number of Americans are not voting. So I think sometimes when you talk about like democracy and the need for like people to have a voice, I see that most people don't seem like interested in exercising that power even when they have it, and even when they could have a huge impact. Most people are, willing to just let whoever deal with it and, handle the consequences, even if they're not the best for them. So I think maybe this would be like a critique to your idea of like worker democracy.
Hey, you got to bop them.
Yeah, gotta bop them. Tell me about
You got
that.
to bop them. You have to bop them. The average, peasant wasn't interested in or capable of participating in democracy back before, we enabled that process. People have to be educated for democracy. If you were to, like, I mean, imagine, for example, you were to take like a 10, 20,000, 14th century French peasants and bring them into modern day France. Obviously, they would need to catch up on quite a lot, but I don't think they would be able to be very good citizens. Not just for linguistic difficulties or illiteracy or anything else like that, but because the idea that you should have control over your life is something that people kind of have to be taught. We see issues with this in former Soviet countries, where democratization was suddenly introduced to a bunch of former Soviet bloc countries, which were incredibly autocratic beforehand. And you had issues where they weren't good at democracy, not just because of corruption or oligarchy, but the people weren't educated for democracy. It requires a certain framework, a mindset, a belief in the potential for democracy to function appropriately. Because without that, people will turn to autocrats, as historically has happened many times in situations where people lose faith in democracy. Um, I don't think people have much faith in democracy right now here in America, hence our abysmal national election turnout and our much worse local election turnouts. I think we're trained for apathy. Apathy, of course, is what makes us, at least in a political sense, the easiest to control. Because it means politicians have to give us less to continue the system moving forward. Politically engaged, active, ideologically driven citizens are the kinds of people who will make life hell for lazy or negligent politicians. You know, if everyone's just kind of like, for example, a ton of people came out to the election in 2020, right? And by a ton of people, I mean like 66% of the country. Like, you know, yeah, great for us.
Barely over
But
half.
yeah, like a pretty pathetic amount compared to a lot of other countries with better democracies than us. And a lot of the people came out because they were afraid of Trump or because they were afraid of Biden. But the people who voted in Biden are I mean, what are we living through right now, right? Very little gets done when presidents actually win. Even Trump, as bad as he was, most of the work that he did was extra legal, you know, deconstructing elements of our democracy. And Biden can barely get anything passed through the Senate. This is trained apathy. The less we expect of our government, the less we demand of them, the less apparent difference there is between an outright fascist and, you know, dawdling old neoliberal. Or I guess he's not really a neoliberal, liberal. Um,
Aggressive.
Progressive liberal, if you will. Dawdling will keep. But people grow apathetic, and it's unfortunate. Apathetic voters are not as likely to be demanding, and it means that the general bar for political engagement is drawn down significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to hear this sort of like discussion from you because I think it's a very realistic approach to democracy and to the need of some sort of cultural framework for that democracy to exist in. Like people talk a lot about the Nordic countries, right? And I think they have like a very interesting and unique history with democracy and with, you know, the way that they approached social good and those sorts of programs and you know the history of education reforms through protestantism and so on that we don't necessarily have elsewhere, you know, in other countries. We have some like versions of it in America and elsewhere, but I do think that like what we see happening in democracy, especially local democracy, where people have a great deal of potential influence if they did get involved, is like an uninterest in getting involved. And my impression would be that if you were to convert businesses to workplace democracies, right, force workers to have some sort of vote, some sort of say, I don't know exactly what that system would look like, but I would guess that most American workers, you know, they just want to work, they want to get through it, they want to get out of work, they want to collect their paycheck. They're not hugely interested in the politicking of the workplace. And maybe they vote. Hopefully, they exercise that power when it's given to them. But I think more likely is that there's going to be some group of workers in any workplace that are just naturally like more interested in engaging in that sort of politics, in rallying votes or you know championing a cause. And probably also there's going to be some group of people that are more able to do that just through social connections or through competency. If they're like a highly competent engineer, they're going to have an easier time getting people to like vote with them than with not. And so this small group of people is going to have like an outsized enormous impact on the actual workplace decisions. And it's also going to be the small group of people who are willing to do the politicking and whatnot in order to get promoted to those places of management in the first place. So I think that like realistically, without some sort of cultural, you know, technology, some sort of cultural shift towards democracy, we'll probably see like a very similar workplace arrangement in cooperative or democratic models where like a small group of, you know, highly motivated, highly competent people end up just running the show anyways, and most people are not super interested in engaging with it.
I think there would be a distinct improvement, even if there were no broader cultural shifts, if only because while there's a chance that the most politically engaged worker would still supersede the will of the broader working population of business, we know for a fact right now that the current model with the autocratic business owner, it does have a different set of interests empirically. So it would be a guarantee for a maybe of bad outcomes. But I do agree with you completely. an immediate shift to worker democracy without any kind of transitional period would be, I think, disastrous. In large part because I think most workers would turn towards essentially, I guess, the economic equivalent of strongmen. They would turn towards people who say, we'll handle the paperwork, we'll handle the data, just sit tight and things will be okay. And you would be able to imitate, maybe not to the same degree of severity, but at least to some degree, some of the more pernicious elements of autocratic economic systems. I think it's possible to introduce people to the worthwhileness of worker democracy, if for no other reason than because that used to kind of be the way things always were. Self started business was, I think, the norm for most of post agricultural human history, simply because the superstructures for corporate enterprise didn't exist in the same way. Like a lot of businesses, I mean, it was literally like a merchant would sell their wares, a farmer would grow their stuff and then sell their stuff at the market. People would have the milk, or they would sell them. Yeah. So stuff like that, right? And while we don't have sociological data from 500 years ago, not good stuff at least. I mean, it's all very speckled, like the cows they were milking. We can still see general patterns emerge in how people reflect on the nature of those workplaces and those businesses. And I think that generally people like having a sense of control if they feel like it begets good outcomes. If they feel like there's no point, they would rather defer things to an authoritarian because, at least to that respect, they don't have to worry about it. They don't have to bother. The goal would be to convince people that it is worthwhile. And of course, right now in worker cooperatives, workers do seem to be happier. There is a distinct positive trend between happiness in workers and workplace democracy. So I think if people have an inclination towards this, this would be something worth applying broadly. And people are very malleable. After all, the concept of political democracy as it currently is practiced is very, very new. And it took some finagling to get us to this point, too. But we managed it. America's not doing great, but there are countries that do it better. I hope one day that people would look upon economic authoritarianism with as much disdain as the average Westerner looks at, traditional political authoritarianism. Like 100 years from now, they would go like, people used to have like just obey the rules of their boss, or they'd get fired. They had no say. They couldn't choose their boss. Something. A dream, maybe, but it'd be nice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is that workplace democracies, cooperatives, and like right now, they tend to be founded and participated in by people who are highly invested in the model. And so we're selecting for like this group of people that is already probably has the kind of culture that you'd want people to have in general in society, which is people that are invested in workplace democracy, who care about it, who are willing to participate in it, who believe in it as a system, and so on. And so I think that like
Giga
giga chads, as you may put it. And so when we talk about like, forcing like workplace democracy, I really think that this is an idea that like can work, but the only way that it can work is if it starts from like the culture up. And that's when I think you'll see maybe the benefits that you see sometimes in studies where like these are small sectors of the economy, small firms typically, that are made up of highly motivated, invested individuals who are engaged with the process and want to participate in it. And those people tend to benefit from workplace co-ops in a way that I think there isn't. I would not necessarily believe that the average person would right now, because they're just simply not invested, and they'd likely defer authority, not really care about it, and so on. And so I think that like if you can acknowledge that there needs to be this like cultural shift, but really like the cultural technology and like the willingness to engage in a kind of workplace organization, I would say is like maybe the key ingredient here for making these things work.
Certainly. There's an element of faith leaping to be undertaken past a point, of course, but this is a struggle that we're going to have to face in the world anyway, because we have seen, not only in our lifetime, but we'll continue to see throughout our lifetimes, nations with a long history of authoritarianism have democracy introduced to them. you know, and we have seen troubles, certainly. Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, would be clear evidence of a number of problems, not just with the predisposition of the citizenry, but also with how difficult it can be to have a well-established, political system just thrust upon a group of people with no pre-existing civil society and essentially no like meaningful connection between the people and the leaders we chose for them. But we see this issue crop up. America for a while was only white landowning people who could vote. It's a project that takes some finagling. But when we made the decision to allow people to vote in their leaders, when that was just a thing we decided to set out upon here in the States, we had less evidence then for the benefits of democracy than we do now for the benefits of worker democracy. Of course, they didn't have proper sociological study back then, so maybe it's not the fairest comparison. Maybe there would have been, Poindexters and eggheads crunching the numbers beforehand. But it is, at the end of the day, an ideological predisposition. How much do you value freedom, democracy, free association? Right now, the data trends positive. So all I say right now, prescriptively, is that we should do what we can to make these ideas more popular. And I'd say that as enthusiastically as I would encourage people to engage in local democratic systems at the city and state level, because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing anyway. Your local business is a local political institution. And by making an effort to more thoroughly engage with that, to look into ways by which they can exercise their power over that, they're, I think, doing the same basic thing as attending a PTA meeting or a town hall, what have you, they're educating themselves for democracy, becoming a good citizen. And the hope would be that you could build something off of that, not just advocacy for these systems, but an ability to participate in them should they come about.
Yeah. I think there's a place you might like because it has incredible public housing. It's got great public transport. Cars are very expensive, and great public healthcare options. And it's Singapore, and it's highly autocratic, and it's not very democratic at all. But the culture is such that there is an understanding about what kind of people need to be promoted within the government organizations and removed, depending on what kind of outcomes they can create for people. And there's a broader culture of like understanding what this system means and how to hold people accountable within it that I think makes it effective in the way that like a culture can make a democratic organization effective or ineffective. And so when we talk about these like political systems, I really think that like so much of it has to do with the interplay between the system and the culture and the society surrounding it in regards to whether or not it works in the way that you'd want it to work or not. So maybe something to think about.
No, I agree entirely. In either case, the prescriptions would be the same from my perspective, right? All the data trends positive now, so, or at the very least, we haven't seen any evidence of problems with people who don't want to be a part of worker democracy getting thrust into it and thus having a worse time than they would have under traditional economic systems. So, in the absence of any negative outcomes and in the presence of positive ones, I think it's okay to continue pushing for this prescriptively. Anyway, while I hope one day for a complete abolition of autocratic economic systems, it's not a power that I have. It's not a power that even the president has. So it's more of an an ideological goal that I've taped to the moon. And in the meantime, anything we do to move towards that makes me happy.
That's interesting. I mean, just to go back to something you said earlier, you talked about these like large companies and their negative incentive structures. And I think there's like negative incentive structures for how they treat people working in the company for sure. But there are negative incentive structures for like the kind of things they produce. So I think we look at like a lot of tech and media companies that are highly invested in keeping people like on their websites as long as possible, clicking through content, consuming content, even if it's maybe like to the detriment of their mental health or prevents them from, going out in the real world and engaging and socializing and building these like local communities. In some sense, I think that like the ideal business model for like short-term plunder of the economy is the opium den. And the closer that organizations can get to recreating opium dens, they'll try to do that. And we see that everywhere. I mean, like there is like this discourse on like SNAP and EBT benefits a little bit ago. And I think that like to some extent, a lot of these fast food companies are companies that like are trying to sell people, get them hooked on like incredibly addictive food that is ultimately damaging to like people's life in general. And so there's like I think a schism where like some people are very aware of this like tendency for fast food companies to, you know, create products that are damaging to, you know, society in general. And people want to like get rid of that and are willing to like go to great lengths in order to curb that, even if it's like maybe not the best policy. I'm talking about like banning the access to this sort of fast food when maybe a better policy would be like taxing sugars. But yeah, I mean, I think that all over we see these like these negative incentive structures that are baked into the way the companies do business, and we've really got to address those.
Oh yeah, for sure. Worker democracy wouldn't solve that either. There might be some adjacent overlapping benefits that you would get because there would necessarily be more of a local connection to the decisions that a business makes because those decisions are coming from the workers who have to live there. But I think it would be marginal. This would be more of a decommodification issue or abolition of the commodity form if you feel particularly Marxist that day. But no, I agree. Market economies are always necessarily going to be geared towards the maximization of profit, and sometimes there are negative externalities to that. There can be positives, right? I mean, you know, if you have like a luxury-oriented economies, stuff that people don't need, but they might want, I think that the systems within a market are reasonably good at allocating resources and determining who can actually get it, you know, supply, demand, what have you. But well, I mean, what you're talking about at its core, right? It's corn syrup. You know, we made all of our food, you know, not necessarily tastier, but a little bit more streamlined production wise, and everyone just balloons. Just everyone gets just instantly fat. They hit the world with the fat cannon as soon as they realized they could do that. Of course, there are many social you know, consequences to this from, you know, the medical repercussions to people's general happiness. But yeah, it's the eulogizing of the free market. The people who think that it can do no wrong are very often unwilling to acknowledge these externalities, their existence at all. You could solve this, I mean, even within a liberal framework with proper regulations, but there's a
Mhm.
strong incentive not to, of course, because our government is, people say it's conspiratorial to say controlled. Maybe that's simplistic. Heavily influenced by corporate, you know, incentives.
I mean, there are
And
massive subsidies to like corn
oh
farming
yeah,
in the United States.
and if you were a politician too, if you know, if you're like a senator from Wyoming, and there are like businesses that have plants in Wyoming that employ tens of thousands of people, you know,
Hmm.
and it all like it's not illegal for the people who run those plants to say like, hey, you know, if you're not going to play ball, we can move elsewhere. That's not against the law. That's their free, you know, that's their they can do that, and that's a very strong incentive. It's just power. Corporations have a lot of power. Anyone with power will have the ability to circumnavigate other systems of power, including democracy. And we'll see if we can't do something about that. But
Well, one of the
mm,
things that happens in democracies is you have like small groups of highly motivated individuals who have like a pet project and they're willing to lobby for that project over and over. And if the average person just doesn't care that much, the project is probably, it is a good chance of being implemented. So, like corn subsidies, corn farmers care a whole lot about corn subsidies. You know, farm corporations care a lot about this. A lot of corporate interests care a lot about this, and they're willing to really highly lobby for their point in government. And because the average person in California is not thinking about corn subsidies, it's not on their agenda. Or maybe California is a bad example. I don't know. You know, New York,
oh
one of
no,
these
I lived in
places.
Cali. You're right. Yeah, it's a
Okay,
special interest group thing, right?
right.
We no individual knows enough to counter all of the potentially nefarious enterprising of every other highly technical group out there. Like,
Mhm.
it's not possible. My job is politics. I couldn't possibly. Nobody can. They rely on that, and they slip bills through, and nobody knows what's going on. It seems innocuous, and then later there are massive downstream consequences. Um, I don't even know if democracy can solve that problem. That seems like more of a you'd need some kind of you would have to find, you know, there would have to be some kind of adjacent way of properly educating people, or of having some kind of outside check where people can be alerted whenever something potentially nefarious could be getting through that's too complicated for the average person to understand. Something adjacent to a technocracy but without decision-making capabilities. Like maybe the government would have like independent panels of scientists, doctors, nutritionists, what have you. And if there's a law that's going through and they're like, "Hey, this is important, look at this." I don't know. Um I don't know if there's an easy solution to that. The special interest stuff is just
I think that's a great start. I mean, like another great start would just be transparency, right? Like making sure that the average American knows how these bills are being like funded and how politicians are being influenced by money. Like I think a lot of Americans are they've drank their own Kool-Aid when it comes to democracy, and they believe they exist in this like perfect little idyllic world where whatever the will of the people is like implemented, and it's not true at all. And understanding how special interest groups and powerful economic actors influence legislation would be like a good start to maybe allowing these people to put pressure on the right parts of society in order to, you know, change what gets pushed through, or, hold the right people accountable for pushing through bills that are maybe not to the interest of everyone.
yeah, I'd be interested in seeing how well you could fix that up with encouraging people to be good citizens, Because theoretically, most people can be very politically educated. It's not impossible. It's a big ask, don't get me wrong. Um, but it's not impossible, especially if they only really have to pay attention whenever referendums are coming through, or every 2 years for an election cycle. I feel like you could educate them to a reasonable degree, but bills are so complicated. They're hundreds and hundreds of pages sometimes. They have so many little earmarked bits. Sometimes the people who sign them off don't even know what's in them. So I don't know. It might be possible. Maybe if corporate entities were more liable for lawsuits from consequences following stuff they push for. Maybe there'd have to be some way to make corporations liable for the consequences of legislation they advocate for. That would be really potentially problematic. But I wonder if there would be a way of doing that responsibly, because you do have these like these cases where they're very actively lobby for something that nobody even knows what it's about, and then 10 years later it's like, oh well, now we know. The military industrial complex, for example, knows quite a bit about what America is doing and planning. They have to, because the contracts they receive from our government kind of entail information about what we'll be doing. They get info we don't. So maybe if they push for stuff, they some sort of litigious counter action. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. That's interesting. That would probably be pretty bad, though, if corporations could be sued just for having their names alongside a bill. I'd have to think about that, because you don't want to sue politicians for what they support. If you're suing people for the political positions they have, then that's like a huge free speech issue. Um, yeah.
Something for the policy wonks to consider. I am also
Yeah,
not sure of like what the policy would look like that would best implement, the kind of desires that we want without negative stuff.
yeah, that's a tough one. That's beyond my pay grade. I'll have to leave that to. I'm sure there's somebody in chat with a degree and with PhD in political science who has thoughts on the issue.
Right. Who knows exactly how to manage this. I mean, I gotta say, Vash, seems like we agree on a lot here so far.
Yeah, I'm glad we're both gender abolitionist, libertarian socialists. Since we've covered all the bases, I can only assume I'm filling in the gaps a little bit,
Mm.
but arm in arm.
I would
Um,
definitely not say that I'm a gender abolitionist.
It's okay. I forgive you. Out of curiosity, though, why not?
I think that a lot of progressives have accurately diagnosed that there are problems with gender and the stories we tell each other about gender and how men and women should act. So, like, for example, a lot of progressives have accurately diagnosed that, like, when we tell the story that like men are ultra strong emotionally and never cry and like don't show emotions, that leads to these like bad outcomes where men feel not comfortable expressing themselves and not able to like engage in emotional expression. I think that's really bad. But I also think that like on the other side of that is an understanding that like one role that a man can play in a relationship with a woman or with other people is to be like this stalwart, emotional rock. And part of like the unfortunate reality is just that like men and women on average have like their little bimodal differences in distribution of qualities. And a lot of men like are quite good at being emotionally, like stable. And so telling men that, like, yeah, one of the roles you can play is this, like, ability to be a rock for someone, I think that's a good thing. And so I think that, like, a lot of gender and gender roles, what we're really doing is we're like communicating wisdom in the way that humans do, which is telling stories from generation to generation that like teaches people some like good ways of acting, some bad ways of acting as well. But like when you have a family and that family is growing up without a father, with like a single mother, you're not getting this like modeling from the parents of like how men and women interact with each other and build teams and whatnot. And we see in data that like single family homes, they really suffer. And I think that like that's for a lot of reasons. It's not entirely because of gender. I would never say that. But like part of the reason is because with two parents, you get like a modeling of how people interact and of how like men and women can interact with each other. And like good models of this, I think, are really important. So when we
What
talk
if they're
about
both
gender,
men?
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, what if they're both men? Gay
Yeah.
parents or
I mean, I
lesbian?
think that like if you have like a young woman who's being raised by like two men, I think it is important for like that young woman to have women in her life that she can interact with and who can show her like, a modeling for what like positive femininity looks like. And, their two fathers can teach her an enormous amount about things in general. But like, and I'll give you my experience. It's like a trans woman who is like somewhat attached to my own gender. And I'll say that like growing up, when I saw, women, I wanted to like model myself off of them. I wanted to imitate them. And in general, it seems like a lot of people have this experience where if they strongly identify with their gender, they want to have, people that they can model themselves off of. And so having like a man that they can see if they're a man and is going to present them a positive version of what it means to be a man and masculinity, I think that can be really beneficial.
All right, let me see what I can see what I can get at here.
Yeah,
Just
it's a lot.
so a few points out of curiosity. So I agree that it's helpful if you're growing up as a boy or as a girl to have positive role models for the social expectations that you're going to be brought through. But those expectations are the things which I take issue with.
Mhm.
Gender abolitionism isn't really like a today thing, it's like a potential future. And the idea would be that you wouldn't need someone of a particular archetype to mentor you into what it means to be that archetype because the archetype wouldn't exist. So there are, of course, sexual differences. We have a bimodal sexual distribution, which is going to manifest in any ideological system. There's going to be dicks and pussy. That's always going to be the case. Um, But in terms of the roles associated with those characteristics, I feel like it's possible to allow a greater degree of autonomy in which attributes people decide on. Because what gender is functionally is, at least for cisgender people, and of course trans people tend to get this early on before they realize they're trans as well, is, oh, these are the genitals you have, therefore this is what you must be, therefore because of your biological configuration, here is the set of expectations upon which we will put upon you. um and if you're trans, maybe you can do a little flip switch later on, and I mean, I'm glad people can do that, but it seems like things would be a bit easier if we didn't do so at all, to make gender non-existent and sex as irrelevant to a person's personality traits as race should be, right? We shouldn't go as we used to. You in America, you are black, you are Hispanic, you're a Jew, you're this, that, therefore you must be this thing. We let people decide. So in the absence of those categories being made meaningful, now race is barely a visual distinction. It carries no biological significance. It shouldn't, at least, affect what people grow up to think of themselves as, what they're capable of doing. We should all be able to do what we want. With gender, right? Say you have a person born, they have parents, but those parents aren't gendered. They have a sex, of course, the parents, but that's it, really. Apart from that, they can adopt whatever roles or characteristics they desire. Do you think there would be harm there?
Sorry, repeat that last question.
If you had, in some gender abolitionist future, a child born to two parents, the parents are without gender, and so is the child without an ascribed gender. And the parents, maybe one of them or both of them act in ways which are stereotypically masculine or stereotypically feminine, but it's not because that's their gender. There's not like a hard name for that. These would be as essentialist of categories as being a goth or being a gamer. It's like a thing you can run into. It's a habit. It's a lifestyle pattern. But a gender ascribes some kind of essentialist nature to those tendencies. And I guess that de-essentialization is what I'm interested in. Do you think that would be like harmful to a kid to be born into an environment like that?
Um, I'll say this. I think that you can create a gender abolitionist society that is incredibly prosperous, beneficial, and ultimately teaches people, all the lessons that I think gender acts as a heuristic for teaching people. I think there's a question about whether people naturally identify with people of a certain sex based on, I don't know, some biological brain thing, where like it's possible that like, you know, if your brain thinks it's a woman, right? Or, some part of it, I don't know if I'm saying like, should use the word identify, but like some primordial part of your brain is like
Sex,
woman,
female,
yes.
female
Yeah,
sex,
exactly.
whatever.
If that part of the brain encourages you to identify with people of, the female sex, I think that's like a possibility. And if that's true, that like changes things a little bit, but like I'll just assume that that's like not necessarily true, for the sake of the argument. And what I'll say is that gender is really just like a heuristic for teaching people useful like modes of being. And sometimes, those useful modes of being have very toxic elements attached to them. And so I think that like the progressive impulse to question and remove some of those toxic elements is really good. But I think that if you are pushing people to adopt like a gender abolitionist framework, you're also losing a lot of those like stories that model, what is good or bad behavior between people. And that just needs to be replaced with something else, right? So, and I think that's possible. You also talk about like gender as like a strict versus non-strict category. And I would also agree that like it's quite good to allow people to take on positive aspects associated with like either gender. So I don't think people should be like, they should feel restricted to one specific gender archetype because of their sex or their gender identity or whatever, right? I think you've got to think of them more like gender roles as more like parables or like fairy tales, which you can teach to people, and they're meant to be sort of like questioned and broken in many ways as you get older, but are just like a fundamental like base that you can build on for like what is good or bad behavior.
Don't get me wrong. I don't mind the idea of people having archetypes of behavior they fall into. I
Mhm.
just don't like the essentialist bit because, we put this on people when they're 0 days old. And there can be a lot of negative consequences to that. Obviously, the existence of trans people is a pretty strong argument in favor of the idea that maybe, slapping gender expectations on somebody from the get-go can not work out great sometimes. But I feel like even if I were born in a society which didn't have a concept of men, I would still probably fall into a lot of the tendencies that I do now. Obviously, I'm biased because I can only see myself through my own eyes, but I feel like I have a predisposition towards some masculine coded characteristics that would be present even if I was born in a forest and never made contact with any people, the stories are important, how to act, how to behave, but we've overridden old stories before. Roman citizens were taught stories about Romulus and the foundation of their society and the meaningful distinction between civilizations that have been pacified by being brought into the empire or the republic and the barbarian hordes outside. And usually you had, morality, ethics coded into these ideas. We did the same with scientific racism as well, where for a long time, white kids were taught how virtue was a white characteristic. So, we model these things. But of course, we always find different ways of telling these stories. The stories are important. It's just we tend to do so through the predominant metric of social control in that time period. And right now, gender is considered a relatively innocuous one. Innocuous, sorry, not innocuous. Um, yeah, there are a lot of parallels there as well. Like, for example, a biological in-sex association. It's possible such a thing could exist without being too troublesome, I suppose. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily need gender if people with big tits just tended to have some kind of innate. I don't know if there's an innate predisposition there. I know studies have shown some element of uh, in-group racial bias very early on. Like black kids tend to have more positive feelings associated with iconography and people who also have dark skin. But it's something that through exposure can go away by I think the age of 2. So it's that might not even be a biology thing. That might be a if you have dark skin, you were probably born to parents of dark skin, and since the first thing most people cling on to is their parents, there's just like a brain rewiring that can take place really early in life, given a decent level of exposure to, to other groups. I wonder if it would go the opposite. Don't daughters tend to hate their mothers and vice versa? I'm not sure.
I
That
don't
that could be
know.
a social thing. I don't know. I don't know if that could be a social, but I'm not sure. Anyway,
I mean,
it's the
I agree
essential
with your like
essentialism, I guess.
non-essentialist take, right? The idea that
Yeah,
people
yeah.
shouldn't be like locked into specific roles based on their biology or even by their gender identity, right? Like we can imagine a trans woman who identifies as a woman and, transitions but is like sexed male. That trans woman, I don't think should be like locked in to presenting like an ultra feminine way or even a feminine way at all, right? So I think I'm on board with like your non-essentialist view. I would just say that like gender abolitionism, if it's going to be worked, if it's going to work, it needs to recognize like there is some social reason for why like gender roles are something we see in human cultures across time and history going back forever in different roles and ways and formations, but gender roles continually crop up, and it's because they are like they're a useful way of communicating ideas to people. And so being able to like recognize that and rewrite old stories with new stories, as you put it, I think can be beneficial as long as we're like cognizant of the stories we're overwriting and cognizant that we're telling good stories to replace them.
No, I agree. Yeah, as long as whatever systems you build are capable of supplanting the positive characteristics associated with the old paradigm. Gender, I think, is a concept, though there have been many incarnations, of course. There are societies that still have like a third gender. People keep posting that meme of like the femboy Polynesian on Twitter. I think Soaked on Left did that, where it was like
Mhm.
they had, you know, like male sexed people who were treated as women and
I
wore
think they're like
dresses and stuff.
Filipino, yeah.
Yeah, it was like pre-colonial before the Spanish, I think, ruined everything. I don't know. Whatever the whatever
Spanish.
right, whatever the case may be, whatever the Spanish people ruined. You know, yeah, there's I feel like gender is kind of like a very early stopgap, like socially. It's a very easy way of fulfilling given roles. There's a biological difference between males and females and humans. And when you're in like an early agricultural society, those differences kind of mean a lot, you know?
Mhm.
Like when one half of work is hunting or you know, tending to the fields or killing people, and the other half of the work is home rearing and raising like children and giving birth every like 12 months because you need to because children keep dying, it makes sense that social roles associated with sex would crop up and be pretty heavily encoded. There are other reasons for that as well, really complicated anthropological stuff, but
I mean, it
um
also makes sense why you'd see like the rise of highly patriarchal societies, right? If men's labor is like so essential to like war and agriculture and so on, they're going to have a lot of influence in the culture necessarily. And so,
yeah, most leadership roles back then were just like de facto military roles.
right.
People like they would literally fight for who was in charge. I mean, you know, not a fair contest across the sexes in most cases. But of course, nowadays, nobody, at least very few people, like do any kind of physical labor. Like nowadays, most people do service work or office work. I imagine that even in a gender abolitionist world, people with dick are probably more likely to be like doing construction work or soldiering or whatever. But outside of that, I think the majority of stuff we do doesn't necessarily pertain to advantages or disadvantages associated with sex. I'd be okay with some freaky transhumanist bullshit as well. Like, what is it? Not in vitro fertilization, where the eggs and the sperm are removed, and like everyone's born in your little vat tubes or whatever.
I've got the
Yeah,
picture right. I don't know the name
right,
for it.
some Mechanicus shit, you know. I don't know.
Sure.
Eventually, we'll see what we can we'll see what we can do. But in the meantime, obviously, gender abolitionism prescriptively should go hand in hand with reducing the negative consequences of gender roles as much as possible. But like, it's not about like saying you shouldn't enjoy whatever gender euphoria or enjoyment you get from the system now, right? Like, obviously, I still call myself a guy. You know, that's sort of a long term goal.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think is like a long term goal with an understanding of like some of the social use is necessarily bad to be a gender abolitionist. I mean, I think there's like this interesting fact that we see in the world, which is that in like highly progressive cultures where there's like a very low degree of institutional barriers to women entering different fields, you still see like a high degree of difference in field selection between men and women, as far as like men going into engineering and mathematics and computer science, and women tending to go into fields like sociology or medicine, nursing, and whatnot.
Oh, of course, a lot of that is cultural, right? For example, in computer science and the development of the original home computers, women were equally or overrepresented in early development. It was only after computers began to be marketed as a toy for men that you get this recursive social element where men are raised on computers, so they get into computer science, and then women get like edged out of the field. Lego did that as well, right? Lego was like gender neutral for a really long time, but then they started like edging really hard into more masculine coded toy sets, and then more people at Lego were men because that's how they got into it. They were fans to begin with, right? So there's this recursive thing like air stewards versus stewardesses, you know? No reason on earth why that can't be a 50-50 job, right? I mean, there's plenty of service work where people have to, you know, run about helping dipshits in an enclosed space. down here on ground level, that's 50-50, right? I mean, like general like restaurateur working or being a waiter or bartender or whatever. But then you put them up in the air and it's like, well, 95% women. And sometimes people say it's because women are a bit smaller, but I think that's cope. It's pretty small behind a bar as well sometimes. Those big clubs, like people squeezing around. I think it's just because for decades we had this, cultural icon of like the hot big titty stewardess, and the blue dress with like the
Hmm.
button. Yeah, yeah,
Very
and like
sexy.
and yeah, and everyone thinks of that because everyone, they think that's hot, so everyone thinks of that. So now if a guy's looking at job listings and they're thinking like, well, what can I get? Like that just feels absurd to them, and people hiring know that their paying customers will want hot big titty stewardesses. So it's this recursive thing.
I
That's
mean,
one of those things that's really slow to undo, though. So it's pretty hard to.
yeah, I mean, there's this like interesting anecdote from my own life, which is when I was a kid, like young, I remember school teachers and school advisors always telling me that like, oh, you're like a math and science kid. Like you do really good on these like classes. You know, you're in a very advanced math class and so on. You're going to go into engineering. It's going to be great, etc. And then I came out when I was like 14, 15, and that narrative like totally shifted. And advisors in my life were like, yeah, you could do whatever you want. Like, you don't necessarily need to go into engineering. Like, it wasn't even brought up that like that was my path forward. And it's not like my grades changed. It's not like I, was not in the same math classes or getting the same scores. It's just that like people saw my presentation differently. And so were pushing me in a different direction.
No, no, yeah, 100%. There's this huge amount of variability there. Um, I remember back when I was young, people kept telling me that I'd be good at sports because I was tall and I'm like a big guy. No, I'm not. And sometimes these people would even see me like do basketball too for like PE in gym. No, I'm fucking not. Like they would watch me fail at this and they'd be like, "Oh, well, let's like no, you're working off preconceptions here." Um yeah, and obviously, the more freedom we have to decide the directions we want to take in life. It's not just like trans people are like the big spotlight culturally right now because, politically sensational and what have you, wave of the future, blah blah. But I think that outside explicitly like being a different gender than the one you were assigned at birth, a ton of people just kind of wake up at some point in their life and realize they are a person they never wanted to be, that there were archetypes they adopted because they felt they had no other choice and they just kept rolling with it because the more you go in that direction, the more the people around you expect that of you, which makes it harder to pull out of that. And it's almost like a stereotype, right, of people in like their 40s or 50s rediscovering themselves and having a total fucking personality shift. Sometimes people make fun of that, but in many cases, I think that's because they have a secure career and now they actually can be themselves. And it's kind of sad they had to wait that long. There's always going to be some process of ongoing self discovery, but a lot of that is, business guys realizing that being the business guy isn't all there is to life, or housekeeping women realizing they wanted to do more with their life than raising children, or, crap like that. And vice versa sometimes. Sometimes people do the reverse. People realize, oh my God, I wanted kids, is the less external pressure people face, I think, the happier they'll be on average with the choices they make.
Yeah, I think that's true. I will say, I think it's probably much rarer for someone to like get older, get into their 50s, and be like, oh, damn, I'm so disappointed that I spent my whole life building like this family and these like strong friendships. And I wish that I had just like done the hustle culture and like
That's
become a
pretty
business
fucking
person.
true. Yeah. No, oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm not a big fan of traditional like nuclear family archetypes, but the concept of family or, close bonds in general, yeah. We
Mm.
deprioritize those a ton socially. And women tend to get the blunt end of that as well, right? Because if you're a guy, you can work 8 hours a day and then come home to a family and be a socially normalized family guy kind of dude. But women aren't really afforded that same option. They're expected to be the ones taking care of the kids. Women get judged if they're working. People will be like, "Don't you have a 2-year-old?" And the mom will be like, "Yeah, well, she's being taken care of by some help." And it can get a bit unfair wraparound sometimes. I'm a fan of those big polycule family arrangements that we
Interesting.
used to have.
Can I ask why you're not a fan of the nuclear family?
Um, I think it contributes to atomization. It's a pretty new social
Okay,
phenomenon.
interesting.
Because in plenty of other societies, like people tend to live with their grandchildren or grandparents, like it'll be a multi-generational household. There are downsides to that, right? Like I don't know if I'd want to live with my grandparents, but there are elements of it that are preferable. And right now it just seems like people are really lonely. Like the family unit is really, really self-contained right now, in especially in like affluent communities, right? So at least this is what I've noticed from being about the place. Like black people and white people tend to both pursue nuclear families broadly, but if you go to like poor black areas, the neighbors all know each other because poverty sort of necessitates a degree of mutual communication, whether that be watching out for like concerns neighborhood wise, or like, hey, take care of my kid, or hey, can I borrow this, whatever. Whereas like if you go into the suburbs, which are more multiracial now than they used to be, but there's definitely still an element of white coding, nobody knows their fucking neighbors in the suburbs. Maybe like one over, and it's because they mow their lawn when you mow their lawn, but there's people, like nobody walks around. You're pretty left aside, and I feel like the nuclear family encourages that. As the Black Panther Party actually discouraged their members from ever marrying, because they felt like marriage was the death of the political agent. That as soon as you marry off, you're like you suddenly have a greater like personal priority than commitment to the cause, which is a wonderfully militant way of expressing essentially the same point I'm making.
I mean, I guess I would say that I disagree in quite a lot of ways. But and you talk about like the nuclear family contributing to atomization. I would say that it's the opposite, where the degradation of the nuclear family, the encouragement of people to engage in like short term relationships, casual relationships, leads to this feeling of like loneliness and the inability for people to like put down roots and start building community. You bring up like a good point, which is that suburbs tend to be like pretty bad for encouraging like community building or neighborhood building. But I think that's like a little bit different of a question of like whether or not the family unit itself is beneficial. So I think you can have, nuclear family units that within them there's a lot of community building, there's a lot of like strong partnerships. And then also nuclear families that are interacting with other nuclear families. I'm not necessarily like opposed to like bigger family structures where like you're inviting grandparents in or cousins into the same household. I think that's like legitimate. But I would say that like the nuclear family and the willingness to build family relationships, start families, which is something that we see like precipitously on the decline, not only in America, but in, countries across the world, is something that I think is contributing to this problem of loneliness. And it'd be an improvement if people were more focused on building those family relationships than they are currently.
I can't find a source for what I said about the Black Panther Party. I might have just made that up. I swear I remembered it, but I can't.
I'll believe you.
Okay. Yeah, well, don't no. I could be wrong. Just yeah, don't judge me. Lefty misinfo and all that. I guess the issue is that like the areas of the world that have the most committed nuclear families are also the ones that seem to demonstrate the highest degrees of unhappiness, right? When you talk about like level of community involvement, like the suburbs are the worst. And then you have higher levels in poorer areas, not necessarily happiness, but like feeling involved with your community. There can be other negative externalities with regards to happiness because they're, fucking poor, right? I mean, there could be other things affecting that, but they tend to be more community inclined. And then if you go to countries like Brazil, where many people are much poorer and they live in these like ramshackle tenements that stretch out across the hills, where oftentimes like you have your family, but you have like your neighborhood family too. Like there's multiple overlapping levels of direct community engagement. You have people who have a much greater degree of community involvement. Again, that's not to say there can't be negative. I mean, I tend to associate this with poverty, but I feel like wealth in this case tends to insulate people from others. Many people's dream is to be like away from others, and they don't realize what that does to them. I think it was there was some Greek philosopher who set about trying to discover the science of happiness, or I guess the nature of happiness, not really the science, who found that, and this is a highly unscientific discovery, but he found that living in a large house, um, Chad, it's not Socrates, chat. Do you know only one Greek philosopher? Jesus. Um, that living in a large house with a collection of your friends and just like chilling, Epicurus, thank you, is like the best way of living your life in terms of direct happiness. Like they can be family, you can be fucking them, you can be not fucking them, you know, you can be wealthy, you can be poor, but being around friends is what matters most. And it seems like the pursuit of the nuclear family in the modern era has been kind of to the detriment of community. I don't think it's a juxtaposition between nuclear family and a bunch of shiftless, like, you know, fuck buddies, and then you like have cats when you're 45 or whatever. I feel like the community bond should be emphasized, and the idea of walling yourself off with your married partner should be the thing that we're sort of pushing back against. If you live in a multi-generational household, after all, it's not a nuclear family. Or if you live in like a larger space with multiple other couples, that's also not a nuclear family. And I think those are nice arrangements. I think they tend to make people pretty happy. That's how humans lived back in tribal societies back in the day, right? I mean, whether or not we had marriage back then, you know, people would just fuck whoever, and then the kids would come out, and they would just be sort of raised by the village. I also think two parents is just not enough to raise kids, especially in the modern economy. It doesn't seem like enough, you know. Kids should be able to interact with, you know, few people like in the day to day, not just, you know, you have like the mom and then the dad comes home from work and he passes out. You know, it's a variable thing. A lot of this is just us projecting things that we like, but there is some research on different types of family structures next to levels of community integration.
Yeah, community integration. I don't necessarily know the data on community integration specifically, but like if you look at the data on married versus non-married people, and I won't necessarily make the claim that it's like all causal, but the correlation is like enormously positive on like pretty much every metric, like, you know, reported happiness and like financial health and so on. And this is like sort of a conservative meme. And like, I don't think if you get married, you'll suddenly like be super successful in all of these ways. Um, but I think that it's like one component of creating bonds with people. And so if you treat like marriage and family and the nuclear family as like the end all be all of that community bonding, that's really bad. That's, you know, going to be disastrous. But I think if you treat it as like one necessary part to like build family and to engage in these like marriage structures, even if they're not like, you know, legalized or whatever, but creating those, you know, strong relationships with people, that's something that I think is going to be beneficial for people. And certainly better than like the highly atomized, like highly casual approach to relationships with it, which I think people tend to take.
Yeah, well, I don't really. I'm not a big fan of marriage personally, but you know, I'm not here to yum yuck and take marriage away from other people if they're so inclined. If people want to get married, then that's a-okay by me. It's the exclusion of additional metrics for community integration that I
Mhm.
take issue with, because often that is what it is. You know, marriage is the wall off for a lot of people. You know, well, because once you get married, and this is true by the way, once you get married, a lot of people stop like changing and they stop making new friends. Marriage
Mhm.
is seen as a kind of social end state where you've succeeded. You must have had some degree of personal financial success because marriage is heavily biased in favor of people who can afford things associated with marriage. And socially, you found someone willing to spend their life with you. So, you know, congratulations, end state, good for you. And then people never grow or change after that, which can be pretty unfortunate. It wouldn't surprise me if people who are married are more happy than people who aren't because you're pre-selecting for a couple of things with married people. For one, they have a partner, right? You know, someone with them. Marriage does tend to, be a product of communities that have a higher average income, um, stuff like that.
Also,
But
religious communities.
religious communities, but nobody wants to be part of those. Um, yeah, there are a lot of multivariate confounding elements there. Um, but ultimately, people should be into what they're into, right? If people are given the freedom to choose, they should be given the social respect that should come with that freedom. And as it stands right now, even though people have the freedom to not get married, we don't respect that choice very much, right? It's considered kind of a failure to be old and to have never married. Now, I do think it's sad if people are old and have never loved, or old and have never had a relationship, or stuff like that, right? But marriage is a pretty artificial, contracted boundary around um, those around relationships people would have been having anyway.
I mean, I think that the freedom to choose oftentimes leads people to choosing whatever like feels good in the moment, whatever is pleasurable in the moment. And a lot of times those choices are short term and they're destructive. Like it feels good in the moment to like choose to eat, fast food and whatnot. But like long term, that can be like destructive to your body. It can make you less, focused, less healthy, you know, really decrease your quality of life. And I think that
But they're
like,
right.
yeah, and so I think that like maybe there's a similar thing that happens with marriage where like there's this like freedom to choose what kind of relationship you engage in. And the immediately like pleasurable thing to do is to like pursue lots of casual sex and like hookup culture and whatnot. Like our little monkey brains are like programmed to like love this sort of thing. But ultimately long term, it might be like a lot better to develop like long, stable, lasting relationships. And I
You can
won't
do both at the same
necessarily
time.
wait, what is that?
Oh, you could do both at the same time, though.
Yeah, yeah. And this is exactly what I was going to say. We're like, some people are very capable of doing both at the same time. So, like, some people are like very good at being polyamorous. Um, and they can have, a partner and they can engage with other people. Some people are not good at this. And so, I think you have to be like very mindful that if you're the kind of person who is not super good at you know, who has is like choosing one or the other. The thing that might feel good like in the moment might also come with consequences long term. And you might feel like, especially if you're a woman, men, thankfully, you have to worry about this less. But like, unfortunately, the reality is that like women tend to go for older partners and men tend to go for younger partners. And so if you spend your 20s like engaging in a high degree of like casual sex and not really pursuing those long-term partnerships, you might find yourself in your 30s or 40s less able to develop those long-term relationships just because the dating pool has shrunk so much. And again, that's like that sucks, but like that's the reality that a lot of women find themselves in. And so like I think they're like there's it's a good thing if the culture around you can encourage you to pursue these long-term bonds that are going to enable you to have success later in life. And that shouldn't be like the end all be all. You shouldn't wall yourself off after that. But it can be a good first step to combating some of that isolationism, atomization, and loneliness that people experience.
I have to push back on a few things here. I don't disagree with the broader point, of course, which is that a realistic understanding of what types of relationships will bring you happiness is something everyone should adopt. Certainly, there are people who pursue, hookups, in some sort of vain attempt at grasping something that they're not really looking for because they don't like know to look for something more substantive. Though, to be fair, what with the average age of an American marriage being like 8 years these days, and a ton of people regretting getting married early, I don't think that's a unique take on either side. There are plenty of historical and contemporary examples of people being rushed into marriage because they felt like that was not even just because it was the end goal, but because they've been sort of socially um, conditioned to believe that's like the desirable end state. And then they have no idea what they want in a partner interpersonally, sexually, and then they end up getting divorced. And it's like, well, a lot of folks get divorced these days. Marriage as an institution seems to have been one which was economically prudent for a time, but is becoming less so in an era of gig economies and two income households. Um, So there's been a paradigm shift with respect to that, certainly. And I think the average age difference, at least in America, between men and women is about 2 years. So it is true that men often lust after like younger women, probably to a really inappropriate degree, in many cases, judging by the prevalence of certain porn categories. Um, I don't know how much that bears out in like the marriage statistics outside of that gap. And I think that's something culturally that you could address as well. Um, After all, the reasons why people are like that dynamic tends to play out are pretty socially conditioned. It's not like some biological inalienable thing, right? A lot of men sort of fetishize vulnerability, youth, naivete, inexperience, and sexual virginity in women. So, yeah, I mean, there's no biological reason to go for that necessarily, right? Um, it's not like some female fertility thing. I think there's a lot of bad Evo psych out there around that, but I don't think that's the case. Um, Even if it was, you could counteract those. We counteract much more. I mean, humans biologically had a predisposition towards sexual assault. We had to make up laws against that, of course. That wasn't some inherent thing, but we did, and things are better now because rape is illegal. So, we can always make those changes. I just, I don't disagree that like, pairing off like long-term lifetime partners can often for many people be a really good thing. I think, having lifetime partners is fantastic. I just worry about some of the language here because it trends towards the idea that it is a mistake to spend a good portion of your life just hooking up or whatever. The language you used, like you're on a timer, you don't want to be 35 and all the men are dating 27-year-olds, I feel like there's a degree of alarmism there that's a way of kind of scaring people straight into a more socially conservative role. Which, yeah, I don't know. I think people should have the right to make their choices, and if those choices end up having negative outcomes, that's just part of freedom.
Yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it's always a mistake. Because I think that like a large number of people are going to be able to engage in like casual hookup culture and still find like long-term partners in the future, both men and women. And moreover, there's also going to be like some group of people who are going to be like comfortable never, establishing that like long-term partner. They don't necessarily need it, it doesn't benefit them, whatever. Like people, there's a great degree of like variety in people and the kind of relationships that people want and will benefit from. Like talked about polyamory as well. Like there's some people who I have no doubt benefit from polyamorous relationships, open relationships, and whatnot. But there's also a lot of people that don't. And I think it's more a matter of understanding what kind of relationships you want and meaningfully, mindfully pursuing those. And then also understanding that in the future, what kind of relationships you're going to be interested in might change. So even if like your little monkey brain is telling you to like have a ton of sex now, you might also understand that like maybe in the future you'll want that long-term relationship and you might have some consequences of pursuing casual sex now, just in like opportunity cost, as far as not having pursued that kind of relationship earlier. So I think it's more a matter of just like people need to very critically understand their own relationship goals and be cautious of maybe their goals changing in the future.
I get that. I do think that people's biases are towards your direction, though, right?
Mhm.
Like the social messaging encouraging people, like you got to get married, especially for women. You got to get married, find the right man, whatever. Those are powerful, like mainstream media codified messaging that might distort people's otherwise, well understood internal beliefs and preferences. Whereas, hookup culture is more of a Well, it's still not treated that great in broader culture, right? I mean, it's certainly there's some like begrudging, grimy respect for the process. It's sensationalized in media sometimes, but I don't know if it's thought of. It's usually sensationalized in a way which is meant to kind of undercut its health, right? Usually it's sensational because it's destructive, hookup culture. But a lot of people just do hookups because they're trying to find someone worth spending more time with, right? Like I can only really speak from my experience, but like I don't usually because I've done a decent amount of hooking up. And when I do so, I'm not usually thinking like, I only want to meet this person to fuck them. I usually meet a person and have sex with them. And like, if they're cool, I become friends with them. And if they're cool friends, then I might end up starting a relationship with them. But that's just a metric by which people can enter long-term relationships now. Whereas before, it was more of a who you met at your local church group type deal. If you had to choose between those two, I feel like the former is probably a healthier way of going about things because you avoid that issue of not knowing what you want in people. At least you're being discerning to begin with. As long as nobody has an issue with a person having a body count beforehand, it seems like a relatively not efficient, cautious way of going about things. I certainly know I would feel more reckless entering a marriage with a person I didn't know too well, than I would ever feel reckless, like just hooking up with people off of Tinder or whatever. To me, like there's way more loaded into the potential for like a bad marriage. That's a bad hookup is like a bad story, assuming I don't get killed. But who knows these days, right? Could happen to any of us. A bad marriage is like a life altering fucking train wreck thing you have to you know what I mean, right? Wait, actually, I'm curious, are you married? Not to dig at you, I'm just curious.
I'm not married, no.
Okay, yeah, I don't know, that's how I feel about it. A lot of people really romanticize the idea of like tying off the knot or whatever, and I'd like to have a life partner, don't get me wrong. The marriage as a legal institution is a little bit frightening, I think, just because there's so much econ stuff wrapped up in that. But conceptually, I think it's nice. But I think you can pursue one into another potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's correct. You used the word efficient earlier to describe the process, which you backed away from, but I think that's accurate. I think that a lot of modern technology enables incredibly efficient, like courting of people and courting a lot of people. But at the same time, we're not necessarily seeing that borne out in like long-term relationships. So like you mentioned like marriages being prone to divorce. That's certainly part of it. Another part of it is that like if you are not invested in like long-term relationships, if you're engaging in hookup culture and you're invested in the idea of like pursuing this sort of like pleasurable experience, I think that desire is somewhat at odds with the desire to like really commit to someone, even just for like year after year, and eventually build that long-term relationship. So I think that like a lot of times with hookup culture, what you see is people, they're not having sex with a new person every night. That's on the extreme end. But rather they're having, they're getting intimate with someone for a few months at a time, or, a year at a time, 6 months at a time, and then they're moving on to another person. And that's maybe a little bit more dangerous,
Okay.
because,
Can I ask you something
yeah,
pointed about that, if you don't mind?
please.
What is the contradictory element between those two things? Like, what if you're meeting people, you're fucking them, you're spending some time with them to see if like things would work out for a long-term relationship, and then if they don't, like maybe you move on to another person. Like, what if that's just because like technically, if we're talking like say two people get into a long-term relationship at the age of 24, what's the difference between the person who was a virgin up until that point and the person who like hooked up with a bunch of people beforehand to kind of find out what they liked, and then when they found a person they really liked at 24, they went up with that?
I also say that like it probably varies from person to person, but I would actually maybe be like a little bit on your side here, where I would say that like having prior relationship experience, and prior sexual experience is a benefit when it comes to developing a long-term relationship, right? That's an advantage in like making things work, being able to negotiate with your partner, be a good sexual partner, and so on. Um, and so if you're using like Tinder or whatever to develop these like relationships, these short-term relationships, maybe you even intend for them to be short-term, but you're also using them as like meaningful, practice, experience, learning experiences to make yourself a better partner, someone who's more capable of really contributing to a relationship. And you're also the kind of person who knows that you want to have that long term relationship eventually in the future. I think that that can be like a totally fine choice for you to engage in that kind of sexual experiences. I think it's only problematic if you are using these sort of like sexual experiences instead of pursuing a long-term relationship, or you're doing them, with the intention to maybe knowing in the back of your mind you want to have a long-term relationship someday, but you're not actually trying to develop any of these short-term relationships into that long-term relationship. That's when I think it becomes maybe a little bit destructive.
I agree that there are it's bad when people want a thing and they're pursuing that thing in a manner which is ineffective. I
Hmm.
acknowledge that. Though there are people who I think just want to do that, at least for some periods of their life, right? Like it is possible to have people who are just sincerely uninterested in some kind of, deep romantic companionship, but
Hmm.
the desire for sexual companionship is I think something a lot of people are going to have pretty ubiquitously throughout their life. So to meet one of those desires without pursuing the other, I think is if it's something that would sincerely make you happier, if it's something that you're pursuing with like a strong understanding of what makes you happy, that can be good, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're the kind of person who knows absolutely that you're not really interested in that form of like long-term companionship, for whatever reason, you're like totally sure, we'll just say hypothetically, then yeah, I don't think there's like anything wrong with pursuing casual sex. Like you said, I think it's only a problem if they've, maybe got this eventual goal, or if their goals change as they get older and they discover that they've been, the actions that they've engaged in have made them less able to have these sorts of relationships that they now want.
As long as people are acting towards their own desires. Of course, we can never know that from an outside perspective unless we know them really, really well and we can, make judgments for them. Um, yeah, but outside of that, it's always going to be really difficult to say. I feel like the casual sex thing right now is basically just a modernized and less conservative extension of how people used to date around back in the 50s, right? I just imagine that back in those days, you would just have like one or two dates with like the high school jock and the cheerleader or what, and they'd have like a milkshake or like what they call it, a malt at like a
Sure.
local bar, right? Yeah, and like
Go down
that'd
to the
be like,
diner.
yeah, exactly. And then like they'd get the vibe or whatever, and they'd make their decisions. But now people just like fuck on Tinder, right? But functionally, the same social role is being filled, which is you're determining whether a person is right for you. I think there's probably a lot of utility, or maybe not utility, but I feel like at least it's more honest the way we handle things now, right? I don't see any reason why sex should be restricted just to a romantic relationship. So the idea of like potentially getting into one, like a marriage even, and you have like this religious virgin till marriage, promise ring shit, where like you have no idea what's going. Like you might not have even seen them naked. Like what? Yeah, to me, this is like a very antiquated set of social standards that hookup culture has um, cut through. That there was like there was this layer of social conservatism that made life like pretty much empirically worse. That hookup culture managed to destigmatize the alternative to. And even if some people are unhappy with some of the decisions they've made in life, we're more free to choose which direction we want to take. Because in 1950, if you were a woman participating in the then equivalent of hookup culture, they'd be like pouring pig's blood at you or whatever. But yeah,
Well, not just that, like if you go back before 1950, before the pill was invented, there's like a very real chance of getting sex or getting pregnant and like not being able to get an abortion.
shotgun weddings. Yeah, they line you up, and it's like, well, got her pregnant. Good luck. You're 16 and you're married. I don't know. There are so many social consequences to giving people to loosening social standards and giving people the freedom to choose which direction they want to take. And there are definitely like course corrections that can be made. There are definitely ways to socially incentivize good behavior, but I'll always prefer the negative externalities associated with people's free choice to make decisions about their own life than I would hope people's, sort of coercive social standard influenced decisions work out enough of their favor to be preferable to the alternative, you know?
That's a very interesting take because I also feel like you very early on we started this discussion and we talked about creating social pressures that encourage democratic organization within your workplace. And it seemed like you were very much a fan of creating social pressures that would have good outcomes rather than necessarily allowing people to like engage in the freedom to join autocratic, you know, private organizations of labor.
Yeah. The idea would be to educate people to be a good citizen, as I guess we should educate people to be a good hookup culture participant, or whatever the equivalent of that would be. But there's a critical difference between, positive cultural incentives to make people amicable to better systems and negative social stigmas against people who won't follow those. I do think there's a categorical difference from social influence when it's being used to make people good citizens versus when it's being used to like slut shame women for fucking before marriage or like, suggest that like hookup culture, is like a disensoulment process where it makes you less of a human, which a lot of conservatives still believe. Is it disensoulment, desoulment?
I'm not sure. Never heard this word.
It's a wild, yeah. It's not. I don't think it's bandied about that frequently, but yeah, it's social pressure should always be used responsibly. Like I'm okay, for example, with the social pressures towards trans acceptance, because I feel like doing so sort of expands people's positive liberties. You know what I mean? Like even if you're changing the information that people receive from, say, a binary mode of sex and gender, where the two words mean the same thing, which was commonly taught and still is commonly taught in a lot of places, to a more nuanced and trans inclusive, way of thinking about things, I think that increases the potential for liberty. Whereas the alternative, which would be switching it back, while an alteration of equal size to the curriculum, would be one which brings about negative liberty because it decreases people's information, increases the likelihood of condemnation.
Okay, interesting. Something to chew on for sure regarding liberty and what that means.
I'd like to believe I like freedom quite a lot, though everyone says they're the most freedom-loving person. So it's a constant, ranking battle.
I think freedom is one of those things like happiness, where if you tell someone, I like freedom or I like people being happy, it's like, wow, great, we totally agree. But then you find out they think that in order for people to be happy, they need to engage in this like very strict, way of, engaging with society and with culture and other people. And you believe in a totally different one. And so I sometimes think conversations about freedom or happiness or these sorts of things, they can be like a little bit obscuring of what we're actually maximizing for.
Oh, for sure. Everyone pulls it. Like Nazis do this too. They'll be
Right.
like, "Yeah, we like freedom to enjoy the fruits of your race's labor." It's what. Or, yeah, we want people to be happy, and of course, happiness is best brought about the fatherland. It's there.
Right.
It's almost like not the concepts of happiness and freedom, but the terms happiness and freedom are like slotted in everyone's axiomatic, like first principle, dictionary. They always have that like booked in right at the beginning. And of course, it means completely different things to everyone who says it. But I don't know if there's a way to overcome that linguistic barrier because these terms are pretty nebulous and people are made happy by different things anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. Thanks for talking with me, Vosh. Do you have any advice for being friendly with like lefterly people? Because I want to be. I want to have conversations with people like Demon Mama and you and so on and be like, I feel like this, I feel like was good and productive. And we were able to find like common ground, places of agreement on things. But I'm
Yeah,
so new to the Twitch space.
I'd like to think I'm easy enough to talk to. Um, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I saw a post in my subreddit, which then resulted in you tweeting something about how people in my community thought that you were like pole adjacent or something.
Yeah, they think I'm like a
Um,
big 4chan person.
right. I'm not sure where that got pulled from. If there's some spicy drama that they, hurriedly inform me of a moment after I end the call, then I guess I'll learn then. But yeah, I don't really know. People are pretty quick to jump to conclusions. I think, unfortunately, the issue with my community in particular is that, you know, usually when I don't talk to many normal people here, right? When we talk to conservatives, we're talking like hardline ideologues. When we cover content, it's hardline content. So people, normal human people, I try to remind them, usually have not just a broader range of perspectives with different and sometimes seemingly contrary perspectives, just aesthetically, optically, it can be difficult sometimes to immediately parse a person's positions. Like, have you ever talked to a person, like a regular human, not some dipshit online, right? And like a coworker or something. And even though you've talked for 15 minutes about politics with them, you still have no fucking idea like what you would categorize them as.
Right. They don't exactly have like a emoji of socks in real life to
Yeah,
immediately
yeah.
know.
Thank God. That ambiguity is something that my audience tends to jump at really quickly, which is why
Mm.
whenever they hear anything that sounds like a thing they've heard a conservative say before, they believe that the person saying it is a neo-Nazi and so on and so on. Um, I don't know. If you get some backlash from the more left-leaning communities for expressing your opinions, they're a sensitive bunch, but don't let that discourage you too much. Okay, they're as temperamental. They're as temperamental as dogs, and they can be as easily impressed by literally anything you say that they like. They're very 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 very
The wave
long
changes
waveform.
quickly.
Oh yeah, God,
Yeah.
I hate online politics.
I
It's
think
fun.
like the comment about pull is like so weird to me too. 'Cause my entire experience with like 4chan, especially like specifically pull, is being like 16 years old and like being on there because someone linked me a thread where they were like posting photos that I had posted previously on like other social media. And I was just like, in the trenches telling them that they were like idiots and all sorts of probably not Twitter safe words, telling them to do bad things to themselves and
You're
whatnot.
saying Pole is actually not friendly towards gender non-conforming people. Is that?
Right. Shocker. Imagine that. Yeah. So I would like make little skits making fun of them and stuff. So
Oh, well, as good of an engagement as one gets. I think I haven't casually browsed Pole in a while, but I know that sometimes there are threads in there about me. I'm sure they're equally positive towards me as they were towards you.
oh yeah,
Um,
totally.
I appreciate you coming on.
For sure. I think it was a good talk.
Yeah, I think so too. It was a lot of fun. I now have to talk about subjects which are significantly less entertaining. So,
Shame. Boo.
yeah, police brutality.
Oh,
Have
that's very serious.
have a wonderful night. No, boo to police brutality. You got that one. You nailed that
Okay.
one.
A hard topic. I'll talk to you another time, Vash.
Take care.
Good stuff, chat. Good stuff. Um that was fun. I had a good time. Vosh needs to provide credible proof. I think that like part of the conversation is just having like the good faith to be like, well, if we disagree on some like factual matter, we can we can maybe assume one position or another and go from there. And really assume that the person's not trying to like trick you, but that they maybe have something valuable to say. And that's kind of the strategy that I try to take. Good stuff. All right, I'm gonna head out. I'm gonna close out the stream. It's been lovely. You guys are great. We'll do it another time. Thank you for following me on to Twitch chat. Away from Twitch. It was good.